So, good evening and a very warm welcome. We are here on the occasion of the 8th Aris lecture in Tibetan and Himalayan studies. The Aris lectures were established in 2015 and have since then been held every year to celebrate the contributions of Michael and Anthony Aris to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies. We are very grateful to those who have generously helped to endow the annual Aris lectures so that we are able to remember the work of both Aris brothers every year. Both Michael and Anthony were pioneers in the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, each of them in their own way. Michael Aris had been in Bhutan for several years as tutor to the children of the Bhutanese royal family. After his return, he was the first to teach Tibetan language and history at Oxford, even before a university program in this subject existed. His twin brother Anthony is well known through his work as a publisher, first with the publishing house Aris and Phillips, and later Serindia, which has produced the most beautiful and high-profile volumes on Tibet, Inner Asia, and the Himalayan regions. He was also a close friend and supporter of the Tibetan Studies program here, and we miss his presence. Michael and Anthony Aris have not only made unique and long-lasting contributions to the field of Tibetan and Himalayan studies, but they were also the driving force behind the creation of Oxford's first ever teaching post in this field. Without their initiative and vision, and without the generosity of the Rousing family, our current lively and vibrant community of students and researchers would not exist. And we are grateful to them for putting Tibetan and Himalayan studies on Oxford's academic map. Previous Aris lectures were delivered by such distinguished speakers as Janet Katzo, Charles Ramble, Pierre Querne, and most recently, Sarah Jacobi. This year, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Jim Rheingans. Until very recently, Jim was teaching at the University of Sydney, and it would have been a very long way for him to come to Oxford to give a lecture. Fortunately, just this autumn, he has migrated back to Europe, and he is now the chair of Tibetan Studies at the University of Vienna. We are delighted that he's now geographically and institutionally closer to us, and in a way this lecture is also an opportunity to welcome Jim Rheingans back to Europe. Jim Rheingans studied Tibetan studies, Indian studies, and anthropology at the universities of Heidelberg and Hamburg in Germany. He completed his doctorate in the UK at the University of Bristol or Bath Spa, with a thesis on the 8th Karmapa. The Karmapas are one of the big, major, important incarnation lineages in Tibetan Buddhism. After his PhD, Jim Rheingans carried out postdoctoral research at Hamburg and taught at the universities of Bonn and Copenhagen. From 2017 until 2023, he was senior lecturer for Tibetan Buddhism at the University of Sydney and developed the Tibetan Studies program there. Professor Rheingans' research focuses on the religious history of the Tibetan Plateau, and he has published 2 monographs on important Tibetan Buddhist masters, the first on the 8th Karmapa and the second on the life and works of Karma Trinlepa. His research interests also include Tibetan literature and literary theory, and he has published a volume on Tibetan literary genres, texts, and text types that explores new avenues for research on Tibetan literature. Professor Rheingans' work on the Buddhist incarnation lineage of the Karmapas also feeds into the topic of today's lecture, which has the title, Tulkus titles Disagreements, Succession by Reincarnation in Tibetan Societies. Jim, we look very much forward to the lecture, and please join me in making Jim Rheingans very welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks, first of all, for the kind introduction and this wonderful welcome. Welcome to Europe. Although sometimes there is the theory that Australia is a part of the UK that has drifted into the Pacific. And so it's almost like home anyway. And a discussion whether it's part of Asia. Again, thanks for being here. It is a wonderful and festive occasion. And having been in a situation at Sydney where one was tasked to build up a program, I cannot imagine, or I mean, to some degree, but I can imagine to a little degree maybe how difficult it must have been and what a challenge to build up a program towards an existing position with the denomination for Tibetan and Himalayan studies. I think it's a great achievement, and we will talk about these, let's say, institutions and their survival in this lecture. So when discussing the topic for this lecture, we were wondering whether it should be something rather more technical or more approachable. And well, I think this topic is something almost everybody can somehow relate to. And it is something that is also very prevalent in the Tibetan cultural sphere. And that indeed is something at the same time where I was wondering how to grapple this topic. So maybe we could start with a quote from a song by Karma Trinlepa, which is very poetic. So it is actually taken from a letter, but it is incorporated in a volume of songs or poetry, where he says that he remembered the Lama who had actually passed away. Father Chodok Gyatso, protector of beings, even though you possess the unchanging Vajra body, you temporarily show a manifold array of magical emanations, or gutral here. So this, in fact, summarizes the topic from a 15th century, let's say, text, basically the idea, and you find this in many, many various descriptions, that although, and here, of course, the Lama, the Guru, is equivalent to the Buddha, is in fact united with the unchanging Dharmakaya, the manifestation occurs unceasingly for the benefit of beings. So sometimes one talks about the two form kayas or form bodies of a Buddha. So to jump to, let's say, well, the last century, to show some kind of practice, I found something on the internet, and that is about Peno Rinpoche's recognition of Stephen Seagal as a tulku in 1997. He says, I recognized my student as a reincarnation of the treasure revealer Chungdak Dorje. I am writing to clarify the situation. Traditionally, a tulku is considered to be a reincarnation of a Buddhist master who, out of his or her compassion for the suffering of sentient beings, has vowed to take rebirth to help all beings attain enlightenment. I think it's a very succinct summary. To fulfill this aspiration, a tulku will generally need to go through the complete process of recognition, enthronement, and training. So one can see that this is a phenomenon that is still going on. He continues that he has had the responsibility to recognize various tulkus. And he said, since that time until now, I have recognized over 100 tulkus. My concern is to nurture them, but also all others, Khenpos and monks and lay people, in order to benefit sentient beings. And this is the intention, because of this has been done. And I have recognized them in the past and will recognize them in the future as appropriate. So I thought this is a kind of quote through which we can jump into the middle of also current practices. So the subtitle is Succession by Reincarnation, and it's also something that we usually, let's say, outsiders to our field find very curious. And however, this is not, of course, the only one that is possible, and this is a very simplified depiction of that. But in fact, one could argue there have always been, and at a primacy of, let's say, the Buddhist teachings are spiritual achievements. So in the texts of, let's say, many works of Indian Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, when you look at the characteristics of a teacher, Tantric Buddhism, of course, the realization and the knowledge is very important. It has compassion and wisdom, so it has nothing to do with a certain kind of title, being a reincarnation. And that is also one of the topics where we always wonder, why is it happening on the Tibetan plateau or in the Tibetan cultural sphere that it became an institution? We also know of the family lineage or inheritance, often via an uncle-nephew system. And of course, especially in what we later term the Gelugpa school, but also always since the beginnings of Buddhism, the early scholastic centers, maybe Chapa, Chökyi Senge, there were academic achievements that were also some type of, let's say, qualification for succeeding in a certain post. But that's just an overview. So when thinking about the topic, I started to get, well, as it sometimes happens, a little bit overwhelmed by the different possibilities and features, because we find something that we could say is in fact unique, and even hardened historians like Gray Tuttle and myself, we have come to the conclusion, I saw this in a recent article, that it is something, because we do not want to see Tibetan culture as something exotic, and something that is so different from everything else. At the same time, this is a feature that we do rarely find in other Buddhist cultures. Of course, we have the enlightened being as a king, we have the enlightened leader, we have manifestations, emanations, but this seems to be fairly unique. And it is practiced today, as we have seen, in as many implications. So there are, just if one does brainstorming, there are lineages, there are institutions, there are is even a form of government, the most famous, basically, tulku of our time, the Dalai Lama. And there has been the practice of the golden urn, where one could argue that the later Manchu emperors were so annoyed by the Tibetans not being able to find a tulku that they said, we do it by vote, putting something in the urn, or by chance and drawing, which is maybe a simplified version. So all these practices exist, and so it is actually a bewildering array of dimensions. On top of that, we have even more dimensions, such as currently political implications of, for example, the Dalai Lama's rebirth, which is a world political issue, you could argue. There is something like the abduction of the Panchen Lama. There is a Chinese office of the recognition of lamas. There are Western Buddhists. There are competing candidates. There is the incorporation of older lineages into another school, for example, the Jonang into the Gelugpa, who then became a reincarnate tulku in Mongolia. So, it starts to spin in one's head. But luckily, I'm not going to present on all of this. No worries, as you say in Australia, she'll be fine. So that's the saying. But if we look at, if we try to boil this down a little bit, one could argue that maybe a basic definition is that, which is literally a word that is literally magically created emanation, and also related to the Nirmanakaya of a Buddha, as we will see, is a realized Buddhist person who is regarded as the incarnation of a former master, and or as emanation of a Buddha or Bodhisattva. These two concepts are sometimes merged. So we have, in order to do this, we need a doctrinal basis for that, which we find in Mahayana Buddhism. We have the facet of also being an embodiment of a certain Buddhist deity related to practice. We find pre-birth narratives and towards a chain of recognized masters, and we find even institutions with estates, monasteries, and so on, land holdings, tax revenue, you name it. And we also find succession of certain titles outside the system, which I will talk about a little today. So if we look at the different dimensions these phenomena have, I think these are some suggestions. Of course, this is not limited to it, and I will mainly focus on some historical distinctions of a period. There is, of course, the political dimension, but there's also the dimension how these are portrayed in texts. What text can we use to understand this? As well as, of course, as we already talked about, the doctrine, but also a kind of socio-cultural practice within the Tibetan cultural sphere and beyond, as well as psychological aspects. What does this do to a person, and how does it feel to be in such a role? This would be something that will be difficult to find out historically, but that is certainly an aspect that I figured would be important to research about. So, this presentation finally limits this a little bit further. So in order to understand these dimensions and functions in the Tibetan cultural sphere, I will simply focus on the research that I have done and I continue to do based on those various publications, but also going further into them. That means I will look at a few case studies of Kagyu and Sakyapa masters during a specific period, namely the period when the Tulku system kind of became more prevalent, not ultimately prevalent from the 15th century onward. So basically, I will be looking at texts, which you call Namta or Hagiography or Buddhist histories, and I will do some narrative analysis as well as look at the political context. So far, so boring, but we'll find out some more details later on. So there have been lots of previous studies, so it's starting to grow, studies about this topic, but one cannot say it has been exhaustively studied as many aspects of Tibetan culture that we know. Most importantly, in 2017, there was a volume that is commemorating a conference that happened on the tulku system and its different aspects in Revue d'études Tibetain. And in fact, Michael Aris, with his book on Pema Lingpa, pioneered on some aspects of this phenomenon, you could argue. And also Charles Manson, who I think is here, he worked a lot on Karma Pakshi, and his work has been also contributing to our understanding. And many other works which I will have shown here. So looking again at the doctrinal dimensions, we can say that, well, the most basic translation, as you already know, most of you, is the Nirmanakaya, for Indian word for tulku, and that is supposedly a manifestation of the Buddha in the world. Often you find in some text, for example, in some Tenrim text, stages of the path text, you find basic distinctions such as the supreme manifestation, which is Buddha Shakyamuni, or a historical, or not historical, but an actual Buddha with the supreme different marks of the Nirmanakaya, which are specific marks of beauty and specific qualities, which are described in detail in the texts. On top of that, one has also something that is called Tulku, so those who take birth as more or less ordinary beings. And that could be, for example, those different incarnations that we are talking about. And sometimes we have the Zoe Tulku, which is an idea of experts or different people skilled in the arts and crafts. So if you look at contemporary explanations of Tibetan Buddhist masters, you will find also ideas about scientists and so forth. Anybody who is manifesting in this world in order to better it in a way. But it can go as far as you know from Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, manifesting as anything a sentient being needs. So that is in fact the basic concept from Mahayana Buddhism, as you find it in the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, and also in the, I think, the Suvarnaprabha and the Golden Light Sutra, and so on, where we have the three kayas. So this is something that human beings or any being can relate to, whereas the so-called Sambhogakaya Longku, or the enjoyment body, is fields of energy and light, and mandalas only realized beings can have as teachers. So that is the doctrine. So it will be difficult to relate to those, not to mention the so-called Dharmakaya or Tulku, or the truth body, which is not tangible, and which is in some works of Mahayana Buddhism equated with emptiness or openness, and in later works also with Tathagata Garbha or Buddha nature, especially relevant for the Kagyu traditions we will be talking about today. Yeah, but this is not accessible. So this is an important doctrinal background, as well as, of course, the idea of the bodhisattva who manifests for the benefit of beings. Because, of course, we have this kind of habit to always ask, has there been something in India, which is the noble country, the origin of Buddhism, which is similar to that? And to some extent, yes and no. And of course, we have tantric instructions to manifest the kayas in meditation. And when generating a tantric practice, one tries to embody the kayas. We find also many texts entitled Planting the Seed of the 3 or 4 Buddha kayas, where one wants to realize the body, speech, and mind of a Buddha and generate it in one's meditation practice through visualization, mantra, and absorption. And we also have something that is the pre-birth or the previous lives of the Buddha, the Jataka stories. So we do have something that one can consider is related to later developments. So if we look at early factors shaping a Tulku idea, because it was not probably there from the very beginning, still we have studies that have shown that, I think already by Stein and then later summarized and MacDonald, and then summarized by Berunsky here, that the kings had trill, which can be translated maybe as miraculous power. So already the kings that are not supposedly Buddhist had this kind of ability, so that alludes to there already being a connection to a ruler, to the ideal ruler. Then, of course, we have the Dharma kings, which are then considered to be an embodiment of Avalokiteshvara. So Avalokiteshvara, as you know, the Buddha or Bodhisattva of compassion, is basically in something that Schwieger has argued in an article, the whole of the history of the Tibetan plateau any of the Chöjung, the narratives about religion, many things are basically framed within the salvific activity of Avalokiteshvara, even the origin of the Tibetan people. So this is extremely important from the Tibetan point of view. Of course, one need not wonder that the kings are an embodiment of Avalokiteshvara and that the major Tulkus will be an embodiment of Avalokiteshvara. So that is something we find already early. We also find in the masters of the so-called second diffusion of Buddhism, or the Chida or later diffusion, we find descriptions that, for example, Duché has figured out about Mapa and Milarepa. We find that too. There are Tulpa Tabu. They are like manifestations of a Buddha, or like emanations of a Buddha. And in the early Kadampa histories, we also find the early Kadampa masters as Avalokiteshvara, as well as pre-birth stories of Atisha. So it starts to be not only a manifestation of an enlightened being, but we find stories of previous beings as whom they have incarnated. Yeah? So one could argue, to understand who one is in the present, one needs to understand all the beings of the past. And we find many passages about also within what is then termed Nyingma, the old traditions, Guru Chöwang, or also Gampopa, Pakmodupa, who identify their students as a reincarnation of a certain master. So this basically formed the ingredients, I think, of the development we will look at now more closely, the basis for it. And it has been argued by various scholars that the third Karmapa Rangjung Dorje is possibly the first formal, or let's say effectively, not really instituted, but the actual first tulku on the Tibetan plateau that became very, very important for any later development. And so this is the 14th century. So from the 15th century, we have the rise of the system in certain traditions, and we have the first political involvements, as we can see. And it has been already argued by Wiley and others, then one reason for this could have been that the all-powerful aristocracy and also the system of inheritance had some limitations, whereas if you had a tulku as a rebirth, you did not have to stick to a certain family. So you could avoid family feuds, clan feuds, because this is something that's very important. Yeah, the clans are very crucial for understanding these developments on the Tibetan plateau, and of course also some prestige. So in a certain way, it's an innovation, and it was possibly also useful innovation. At the same time, of course, there are conflicts. Yeah, so I mean, sometimes I say in my classes, well, the innovation is that suddenly somebody, maybe you can say that in England, somebody who is a peasant, will suddenly become a member of the royal family. Yeah. And even like the queen, or some kind of. I mean, maybe it's not such an effective comparison, but you would not have to stick to the family, but you could fill the office with somebody from anywhere. Yeah. So this allows some lots of creativity. At the same time, of course, there could be conflicts. And Schwieger has shown convincingly that, especially then in the later time, which we will not consider here mainly, then a certain upper class of society emerges. So from basically the first ideas towards then the 17th century and the primacy of the Gelugpa and the fifth Dalai Lama as a form of government, then this tulku becomes a new upper class that has not existed before, but that is very important within society, as you can see today. So now coming back to Rangjung Dorje, there are various partly conflicting life narratives where Gamble has worked on, among others. And one interesting quote is basically his rebirth or rebirth from Karma Pakshi to Rangjung Dorje, because this has various features that are fairly important. So after Karma Pakshi had died, and his body was about to be burned, he looked out at all his suffering students in the lands of Tsopu and swooned with intense compassion. When he regained his senses, he noticed the faultless corpse of a 3-year-old child in Tölung Patsang and decided to enter the residence that was this corpse. So here we find the so-called Dongjuk, Pravesha, entering the other, or entering the town, literally, the abode, which is another body. After the Karmapa consciousness had entered the corpse, the boy opened his eyes and looked to and fro. The movement of a supposedly dead son's eyes disturbed the dead child's mother. So in some other text you see that actually he sees them in a procession. Yeah, so that, you know, they just suffering because of their dead child. She threw things at the eyes and stabbed them with a needle. The Karmapa consciousness did not think it would be able to help beings if it had no eyes, so it left to look for another body. Apart from an insect being carried by a bird in a house to the north, the consciousness could not find another corpse, so it deemed it necessary to travel to Tushita, the pure realm of Maitreya. I put this in bold myself because this is something we should kind of remember. This story is very interesting, and there is actually a Bardo Namta, a liberation story of the in-between state that goes into detail. And what is also interesting is that later historians try to streamline this story from entering the corpse and the rebirth into one more coherent narrative. Yeah? So we can see, as we have seen also with other corpora of hagiographies, that there's a certain evolution. So this Tushita episode is important, from whence then he decides to enter again the body. So what Gamble considers important, and that I also consider crucial in the readings of the later Karmapas, is that the abidance in Tushita, because that's the pure land of Maitreya. So there is a story that the Karmapa will be the future Buddha Simha, which will be the Buddha which will be the Buddha of Maitreya, manifesting as the supreme Nirmanakaya. Yeah, as one of the next Buddhas. Yeah. So after Maitreya. So Tushita is always there as the placeholder before a Buddha manifests again in the world. So that is important. And at the same time, it is important upon your enlightenment to call a witness and to be admonished to teach. We find that already in the story of the Buddha, which is of course some kind of template. So that is again a different liberation story. In the in-between strait, I saw the earth guardians who admonished me to be kind and to be born in Jambudvipa, which is this world. Through the in-between appearances, they also granted me the empowerment of the 64 Chakrasamvara mandalas. Then they sang verses of auspiciousness. In fact, the story continues, but we can't go into detail. It's very interesting because then there is a dialogue in this in-between narrative between those Dakinis and the Karmapa, who first thinks that, well, this must be a faulty vision, you know, I will ignore you. And they insist and basically kind of scold him that he should now take rebirth and so on. And there's also a very interesting description of entering the womb and the problem that entering the womb could be, and how this would feel and so on. So this genre of in-between life narratives is very important and interesting, and we can actually do more research about that. So what happens, and that's why I think the title of the book is actually quite fitting, is there is what you could argue maybe is an invention of a tradition. And a main difference from those earlier instances is maybe that one is aware of the previous existences, one is aware through the whole process, and this is documented in those narratives. At the same time, there's a big argument for place. So, as you already saw, the people of Tulung, of Tsopu, they were sad. So it is coming back to a certain place, coming back to a certain estate. Yeah, the three monasteries, or two monasteries, Karma, Tsopu, and then Kampo Nenang, which was later transformed. So these seeds become very important in her argument. And I do think that there is a point, that there is a link between the Tulku and the place. At the same time, there's also the argument that basically it's like a scholarship to go to Oxford. Yeah, so some nomad boy who would never be able to have such an education suddenly is able to study with the finest and the greatest teachers. He becomes one of the most seminal scholars of his period, and definitely for his school. Yeah, in the Karma Kajipa school, they always refer to Rangjongpa. Rangjongpa is the role model for almost everything. It's like a Tibetan Buddha. So so you could argue this is also very, very helpful, but this is supposedly an invention of a tradition. Seen from those narratives, of course, this is something that is simply the case. So this sense of place is important also in the relation to the then overlords who basically have some kind of colonial situation, control over Tibet, the Mongols. Access to these other realms provided Rangdong Dorje and others who subscribed to his worldview with a geopolitical vision entirely different from that of the Mongol Empire, which has been forced upon them. The magnificence and the power of these realms eclipsed anything the Khans could create on earth. and his perceived access to them gave Rheingans Dorje and other yogis like him a power that even the Khans respected. So I found this quote quite interesting, especially when we contrast it. I mean, interesting in the non-English way, so actually interesting. Oh, is that correct? Sorry. So, sometimes, you know, it means it's. I found this very inspiring. At the same time, when you contrast it with some, let's say, not narrative but political analysis, which has been done on the basis of documents by Schwieger, for example, he follows on the basis of administrative documents that to the Khan, to the emperor of the Yuan dynasty, the third Karmapa was an outstanding Tibetan cleric, but even so, the emperor still regarded him as one of his subjects whom he could summon to his court. The edict ordering this, issued in 1331, is much more a direct command than a polite invitation. The emperor did not hesitate to threaten the Karmapa should he refuse to come. So, on the one hand, yes, maybe the Khan was impressed by the worldview, but maybe especially the followers were impressed. But we are still having a situation which also sometimes, when you look at the relation of Sakya Pandita and the first Mongols and so on, that is a situation of power imbalance or political power towards the Khan. So this is a different type of analysis which highlights that, of course, we need to find out what we find out is based, of course, on our aim, but also on the methods. If we had more documents for the period I mostly studying, I would be very grateful, because usually in those documents we find features that are often not depicted in the hagiographies by nature. Yeah, those things that are not worthy of preserving for, you know, the future adherents of a tradition, or that are codified into history, but maybe something that the Germans would call maybe Überrest in history, some leftovers that are unintentionally left over, but by the means of which you can follow on some other aspects of a tradition or a person. So staying with this analysis, we have the first, let's say, we have the first two tulkus, which are involved slightly, not majorly, in some kind of political conflict. So this is Gendem Gyamtso, who later becomes the second Dalai Lama, posthumously, and there is the fourth Shamapa, Choda Gyeshe. So this centers around details which we cannot go into: control over central Tibet, relation to the then important family of the Pakmudrupa, but mostly the Rinpongpa, and forbidding of the annual prayer festival, which the rising Gelugpa in this area had started to organize. And so this has definitely geopolitical connotations, that a new school, the Gelugpa, or the virtuous ones literally translated, started to build monasteries, and with Tsongkhapa, who was a very influential scholar, very successful in gathering also not only patronage, but also followers. And well, sometimes it is maybe more simplified as a type of reform, but it was definitely something that was important, and at the same time a challenge to the then more dominant Karma Kagyupa in the area. So one could argue that this is the first time that two tulkus are involved in some type of conflict, but it is not yet a full-blown, let's say, institutional and political governmental conflict. Talking about the Shama incarnates or the Red Hat incarnates, it is maybe helpful to look at an interesting quote, which basically says that there are one mind stream. Because you find the one mind stream, let's say, narrative, or you could call it strategy, but narrative in various other situations as well. Yeah, so there's lots of creativity. So this is an explanation from Karma Trinlepa, whom we will study in a minute. It was known that it were the Je Shama Kache Wangpo, sorry, this is not transcribed into some type of phonetics, and the fifth Karmapa Deshin Shekpa, who had been mentioned in the prediction. So he mentions the prediction that Karma Pakshi would manifest in two, and he says these are the two. And it is said that the body, speech, and mind of the two and the body, speech, and mind of Karma Pakshi are not different. So Karma Pakshi was the predecessor of the third Karmapa, of Rheingans Dorje. Yeah. Therefore, it is known that the two red hat and black hat are one mental continuum, Tukyu Chik. The way of speaking, red hat and black hat Karmapa 2 is based on this fact. So by now, this is something that is quite common, and one could go more into detail, but I think this is sufficient for understanding that a student of the third Karmapa, who had then become in his next incarnation had become or been identified as the Shamarpa, the red hat. So, and also following, there's also the narrative that the Karmapa embodies Avalokiteshvara, whereas Amitabha embodies the Shamarpa. So this is in fact later adopted by the Gelopas with the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama, or almost at the same time, slightly later. So coming now to one of the protagonists that I had been researching on for a while, and looking again at the materials that some of them I had not yet presented. This can serve as a case for somebody who is in fact not officially a tulku, but who has a title. So this is an example that I have chosen to show that there could be even some confusion about when reading those Karma Trinlepa titles, the first, the second, and so on, to jump to the conclusion that somebody is in fact a tulku, as is a Tibetan habit. And I think there are some cases where we have jumped to this conclusion without even knowing so. So that was also my assumption when starting to study the topic first. So he is in fact, from his upbringing, you could argue he had early Nyingmapa and Sakyapa education and was related also to the family of Dakpo Tashi Namgyal. So he had family relations already to the Sakyapa and was a student of a famed Sakya master, Mychen Sanzo Rinchen. At the same time, he was a teacher of the 8th Karmapa, whom we will hear about, and the 2nd Pavotsukdak Trengma, so for Kajupa masters. So he was eminent for both of these traditions, and he was also famous for many other things, engaging in block printing workshops and so on, of the Blue Annals, the Depter Ngurmpo. Why is this important? Because I do think, and it is fairly evident, that at this time printing projects as well as textual corpora generation started to surge. And with it, of course, also the generation and creation of hagiographies and the codification of those narratives that we have heard. So this is in fact very crucial. So how did he become Karma Trinlepa? My basic argument that he basically had an education in Quetzal, which is maybe you could argue a Sakya center in central Tibet and in Ü and Sang. So there in major centers he had his major education, but then he was adopted by the 7th Karmapa and also became a Kajupa. So the key phrase, and this is you find in various sources, is in Chögyal Lünpo he met the 7th Karmapa Chodak Gyamtso and asked for the 6 teachings of Naropa, the key teachings of this tradition. Not only this tradition, but this tradition terms them as the key teachings, the Karma Kajupa. The Karma set promised to keep the transmission. Karma Trinlepa promised to do so. The Karmapa then gave him the title Je Karma Trinlepa and made him the abbot of Chögyal Lünpo. So I do think this passage is very important because it shows how he actually acquires his title. So he is supposed to also act as somebody who will keep the tradition and the key instructions of this tradition, the 6 yogas of Naropa and the Mahamudra, as you see in other texts. So this is just a short passage. And at the same time, in this situation, he's also made abbot of an important monastic center. So he gets the title and he gets the job. And later he gets even more difficult jobs in central Tibet, you could argue. So what is also fascinating is that a little bit later, the 5th Dalai Lama from the Gelugpa tradition, and this is more like maybe outside view or a different view of Karma Trinlepa, sees him as a Sakyapa Geshe who became a Kajupa. Yeah? You find this in his famous record of teachings received. Je Chokle Namgyal, this one, a nephew of an official of the Kurapa, Panchen Chashi Namgyal, so it's very concise information about his whereabouts and family, was a Sakyapa Geshe, but later he became the Lama of the 8th Karmapa. And having been appointed in a position such as expounder of the teaching at Lek Ling in Nyukla, which is, maybe in Shushul, he became known as Karma Trinlepa. Thus in all lineage prayers he is referred to as the omniscient Jetsun Trinle Shap. This is important because the 5th Dalai Lama was to some extent eclectic in his choice of different practices, and there are various practices, for example, of the White Tara going White Sachen, which is a famous Sakyapa master. So this is how he became Karma Trinlepa. So in fact, this is a title. And I think it will continue to be a title. So in my initial research, or my initial hypothesis has been luckily thwarted and I had to come up with a new hypothesis because there's some confusion about those different names. There's a second Karma Trinlepa living at the same time. So if you wonder, well, living at the same time does not always necessarily exclude that somebody is a tulku, but it excludes it to a very great degree. Having a big gap between two lifetimes, up to hundreds of years, is usually not a problem, because that was not read out in the beginning, like Peno Rinpoche has stated in the beginning, that it's very normal that somebody is going elsewhere to benefit and manifest for the benefit of being. So that is usually absolutely no problem, but still you find the stories sometimes trying to explain it to some extent. But we have somebody, Palkang Lotsawa, who lives at the same time as Karma Trinlepa, so more or less. But a little later, so I have argued that, well, this is a title because he is also the second Karma Trinlepa, but lives to some extent at a similar time. And we have the third Karma Trinlepa, who is an abbot of a famous monastery of the Sharma-Pass. And then we also have a fourth Karma Trinlepa, born 1931 in Kham, but there's a long gap, and this is a slightly different situation. So there's a quote which says, "Then this master was of great benefit to the stream of the textual transmissions as well as the empowerments of all Tantra baskets of his tradition, Karma Kagyu. He was included in the line of the spiritual counselors of the father and son, Karmapa and Shamapa, and was named the third Trinle." So with these quotes, which is a quote from Situ Panchen, so it's much later, but still we can argue that in fact this is an honorary title based on a spiritual role that is given. So maybe it's something like a title, like a professorship, where the rector or the vice chancellor is awarding you a certain title for a certain function in a certain role. Maybe this comparison does not hold, but still, second, first, and so on, first, second, third, is not necessarily related to a tulku line. What is also interesting, that with Karma Trinlepa, you do not even find any pre-birth narrative, although we do have an extensive hagiography about him. There's just a story about his parents and that they wanted to benefit beings, and of course there is enlightened aspects of the parents manifesting as Buddhas and so forth, and the aspect of the pure land, the pure vision of Karma Trinlepa, but there is no major explanation of who he had been before. And also he is part of another, let's say, series of titles, namely those great scholars of Dakpo, which is a place in southern Tibet. So he is part of both of them. But at the same time, it is fair to say that this is not really a tulku line. Still, for example, the current Karma Trinlepa says that he was made Karma Trinlepa by the Vajra voice of the 16th Karmapa, which is, of course, entirely believable, but then it is not entirely clear how this is meant. Yeah? At the same time, you see that sometimes still there are people who are recognized as Karma Trinlepa because of their great academic skill, for example. Yeah. So there is quite some creativity within the system. Yeah? So, which I found interesting. So there is much more to it than simply just a tulku system. And now we come to the one of the crucial figures of this period within this Karma Kagyu tradition. Of course, this portrait here has to be and must be a little bit limited. And here we find an example of an early example of a conflict. So, because I have studied this in the past, I wanted to present it here, and I have also found out a few new aspects about this. So, this is a situation where there is a young boy who is, according to the narratives, becoming the Karmapa, but there's also another candidate. And we do have early sources by two of his attendants and by the Pavo Rinpoche, who wrote a major history, who is also his students. So at least the sources are close. Of course, they are not entirely objective, but still they are close. And so we have somebody who is called the Eastern candidate, the later Karmapa from Kham. And there is, because sometimes we were wondering, is there a kind of system in the recognition? Is there something clear? Is it not clear? But we will have some ideas. So he is tested by one of those students of his previous incarnation, by the Situ Rinpoche, who has heard about a special boy, and he's kind of happy by the auspicious omens that appear, the sun coming in at the right time, and so on. And also is depicted as a person of spiritual achievements. Yeah? So this I have talked or published about elsewhere, but there are dialogues where he already talks about the highest meditation practice with his attendants when he is 5 years old. So this is put into, into the story, of course. Yeah, this is a story, and it is up to us what we make of it. And he has supporters in the area where he is born. At the same time, another one of the major teachers, the Gyaltsab, receives news about a second candidate. And the omens are not so great, first. And as we will see, this candidate is then depicted as slightly confused, but his supporters are backed by Dönyo Dorje, which is a very, very important general of the Rinpoche at that time, and who had, as we have not really explained much before, but who achieved control over the areas of Lhasa for some time. And for 30 years he had central Tibet under his grip, you could argue, as well as the Pakmudrupa. So the biographies here and the narratives here are very aware of the problems that this brings with it. So this I found interesting. So even though these are hagiographies, and they still discuss these issues. So these events can be put into context, but maybe we will first look at the passage itself. So how does the hagiography, one of the main ones by this attendant, address the other candidate, who is sometimes also called the son of Amdawa? So a student asks, is the son of Amdawa the Karmapa? I am Karmapa. The son of Amdawa is a rebirth of the Somang incarnation. Somang is another monastery in Kham. Karmapa answered. When Bogawa asks again, is he the one who passed away in Selakang or the one who passed away in Sashi? So there are two different branches. He is the one who passed away in Sashi. He is my monk. So it kind of puts this nicely into, like, he's not a bad dude, as you would say in Australia. He's my monk. He's an incarnation of an important Lama, but I'm the Karmapa. So this is how the story evolves in this Namta via a dialogue, for example. And you find many of these passages. And but at the same time, tensions are culminating. And you have certainly heard about these movies, Kundun or Little Buddha and so on, the different tests that sometimes they are subjected to, testing those young, often boys, we will come to that, sometimes women, whether they remember somebody from the last life and so on. So what is here interesting are two things. I have one passage where this is described. So this tulku, without anxiety or intimidation, gave a few answers according to the situation and stayed free from fear. So they moved to this encampment, which is the great camp, which is the tent village that the Karmapa is normally or used to travel around, the seventh Karmapa. And so the other tulku cried and hurried away quickly. Even so, most of those being partial towards the Western tulku, namely the other one, did not become faithful to this, our tulku. So the author says, they should have been, but they are not. Different people with the wisdom of analyzing prudently have examined the situation for a while, and it became apparent that the Western tulku, although having reached his 7th year, did not know anything apart from the words mother, father, and food, drink. While this, our tulku was unafraid to expound the history of various treatises. One should thus aspire for this one for ours. However, now, the party of the other tulku, the college of Kham, had greater power. So this is actually pretty clear that even though they should have, followed, there is a power imbalance. And that is, in fact, true also when you analyze the political context. So it's not happening because of a certain political control. And that means here that this public recognitions happen, but in fact the author remarks in a Chendrel, in an interlinear commentary, although I do not know from which time it comes, that this is actually not suitable for recognizing a teacher. This is only done for the ordinary people and to please the common mob. One should actually not do this. Yeah. So that is kind of interesting. But it seems that the atmosphere got so heated that there was a conflict about to break out. I mean, actual war or fight. So, but you could say, luckily, this important general, Dönyo Dorje, passes away in 1512, and in 1513, suddenly the rightful candidate, according to the narratives, is enthroned. So this is, my analysis was that, of course, this is, the narratives say it themselves. This party was too powerful. The most powerful guy who's backing them, at the same time, a sponsor, of the whole tradition, is passing away, and then he can be enthroned. Of course, this is not mentioned verbatim. This is not mentioned in writing. But what is mentioned is there was a dream indicating a dream by the Dakinis, the female Buddhas, telling the Gyaltsab Rinpoche he should finally stop those different lies and problems and enthrone the rightful candidate. And in fact, it was very problematic, as you can see in those studies, because the fourth Shama incarnate, which we have already talked about, was supposedly to become the teacher of the Karmapa, but could not. And there is some stories about letters being written back and forth, but because of the different surroundings and attendance and the political situation, who would have to bow to whom and what would be seen as what, they could not meet, which he very much regrets. He says, I'm tearing my hairs out here. So, and I'm crying because we cannot meet because of the circumstances. So already at that time, you can see, and they talk about this, there are quite some problems as well. And even within one tradition, where, and even because of the geopolitical, let's say, issues. What is also interesting, and I have focused a little bit on this, are those skeptical voices in the auto-hagiographies or Rheingans, or maybe autobiographies, however you call it. Yeah. So the Karmapa himself relates that, and that's not really an autohagiography, sorry, but it is a quote to his attendant. From when I died in the tiger, to his attendant, what he said to others. In the tiger year, as the seventh Karmapa, until my rebirth in the hare year, I stayed in the pure realm of Tushita with Maitreya. So now we know, very important for this. So this has become a pattern. And in the pure realm, Shukavati, and was happy. Then, because I was tired of people, I thought it would be pointless to come here for the time being. So this we could also, you remember this from Ranglung Dorje. When thinking so, the protector Maitreya and the wisdom Dakini said, you have to take rebirth in the world. Having taken rebirth until this year, I have stayed in Lorong, where he was kind of protected by his people. Although born in the hare year, I have not heard any invitation from you, the people of the encampment, during the first years of my life. So this is what his attendant says, the people from the encampment, I mean the important karma encampment, you did not invite me. So it's kind of complaining. At the same time, we find those very interesting, the very interesting elaborations again on Tushita, the pure realm of Maitreya. So I think this, I had overlooked this before, so I think it is important to research this further. There's also a Bardo Namta, analyzed by one of my former Tibetan students, Dominic Dell, about the seventh Karmapa, which also is quite interesting. So this is a genre that we should definitely look at. Again, there is also a little bit of a skeptical tone when the Karmapa was older and this title had been awarded, so the enthronement had taken place. It was at the time of training. I was still a child, and even if I had not been one, so he says, langsung, so my youth had not been completed, I did not have in my mind even partially the qualities needed for going to serve as a spiritual teacher of a magically emanated Chinese emperor. So he was invited by the Chinese emperor, and there's the idea that the Chinese emperor is also at the same time an emanation of the seventh Karmapa, his predecessor, or an embodiment of Manjushri, you name it. So, but he says, I don't feel ready. And you can explain this from the biography. He had not studied formally, although he had received the key, let's say, instructions of the Mahamudra, the Great Seal, and so on, by his root teacher Sanjan Yenpa. He was not ready to really teach because he had not received enough formal education. So therefore, feeling intimidated, I was fed up with my own past deeds. And I wondered about my being called Lama of Dakpo Karmapa. For what action is it the punishment? Yeah? Nyepa. So so maybe this is the best translation I could come up with. So this is, I mean, of course there's the humble rhetoric in Tibetan, but this is fairly strong. Yeah? So this is actually a punishment for myself. And you find other passages like this. So because of these incidents, he said the main point is to study what is true, what is Dharma, and what is not, and everything else is not important. And in fact, he became an important scholar, or one of the most prolific scholars. So now moving to our last example is a student of this Karmapa, and that shows this as an example because it is, well, as also Gray Tuttle in some analysis he has carried out about statistical and pattern recognition analysis about the rise of Tulkus over time and space. The second is the most important because that deems whether there is a lineage or not. Yeah? So there might be one great master, but the question is, does this master incarnate? And of course, we have past attributions like Milarepa or the Genden Rupa, the first Dalai Lama, was in fact an incarnation of Dronpenpa, a student of Atisha. I mean, these things, or Milarepa and Mapa, this we have, but this is a later attribution. But the second candidate is always the important one in a certain sense. So Pavotsukrag Trengma at the same time was very vital for writing the Kepegaton, the Feast for the Wise. There is it. Which codifies many of those narratives. And at the same time is also a very important, contains lots of historical information as well, even on the early times, even on law and so on. So it is a gold mine for the historian to some extent. And various other commentaries he was well known for. So what happened with the identification in his case? It was a self-identification in an auto-hagiography, as you may say it, but also later by students and by this powerful Dönye Dorje, as depicted in the Rangnam. So interestingly here again, is maybe a little bit similar to what we have heard before. His previous incarnation dying or entering Tukdam, the meditation upon death, is already meeting his future mother. At noon on the 8th day, my future mother, who was performing a Ganachakra ritual, a tantric feast, was crying and suffering and making wishes to meet me face to face. This is his predecessor. I mean, his consciousness, but in the predecessor's body. When she passed by my body and touched the top of my head, it was clear that I had shifted from my absorption of luminosity, and therefore it was determined that I would be born from this woman. So shifted from the absorption from the Tukdams or Ösel, so he arose from the absorption you do when dying, and that means that he's ready to go someplace else. Then she was given the instructions such as to avoid contaminated food, so advice for pregnant women and so on, especially with Tulkus. This story was narrated many times in a line from one person to another. Then 9 months later, I was born from that woman, and therefore all proclaimed that I was the rebirth of that Lama. And that Lama was called Pavo, so that's why it's the second Pavo. So that is not an official enthronement, but that is a self-identification in an autobiography. At the same time, in this biography, he says that yes, later on he was formally recognized, but there was apparently no conflict. So there was basic agreement, so you can see self-identification and identification by students and by important people. So in fact, these are three factors that we always find or often find at this stage. Any of them, but all three of them. So, but he criticizes contemporary practice. Some, when they hear of great beings of the past, say, this is me. Yeah? It's great. Ngayin, sir. Nga nga. Others say, Vajradhara's reincarnation is Shakyamuni, then Avalokiteshvara, then all the learned and accomplished masters of India and Tibet, while the present incarnation of them is me. Yeah? So this alludes to the practice. Everybody has a pedigree. So you have to be, of course, Shakyamuni or the bodhisattva students. Then you have to be the great Indian masters such as Nagarjuna. And then you have to be, of course, the great Tibetan masters or students of Guru Rinpoche and so on. Yeah? So sometimes when teaching at Sydney, I used to say the slot of Nagarjuna is pretty populated. Yeah? But of course, there's no limit in time and space, so it's also no problem. Others say, I have experienced Buddha only. So I'm the primordial Buddha. The primordial Adi Buddha Samantabhaja, incarnated as the 5 Buddha families of Sambhogakaya, while their reincarnation is the 7 successive Buddhas and the present rebirth of those is me. So I think this alludes to the Nyingma tradition, in fact, to some extent, if I'm not mistaken. So this is, and you find other passages of criticism as well. At the same time, of course, he has identified himself in this narrative. What to do? So we find many of those passages which are critical. Also, there is Karmapa says, sectarian is rife. People are behaving like pigs and dogs. I mean, poor pigs and dogs. I think they couldn't behave pretty well. But anyway, so this is the comparison he's using. So it is also an atmosphere of the time, but you can see some criticism. So summarizing some of those facets, I'd say that we find those from the narratives. We find critical voices, and I'm wondering whether they come more from the let's say, biographies than not, but definitely as well as, of course, propagation of the great qualities and of the missing qualities of a not so convincing candidate or competing candidate and so on. At the same time, there's lots of recognition activity, and this endures until today. And I've also talked with various, representatives with the tradition. So what I found striking already in those texts, but as well as today, is a certain type of ambivalence. It's a big problem, but I'm still doing it. And of course, this could have some use. I don't want to have any value judgments here, but I think one can see an emergence of this topic. At the same time, of course, there's a concern for authenticity as well as a complaining of different methods how to find out about the authenticity. And the pattern that is most important here is often with the identification. It's done by self, it's done by teachers, or it's done by students. So this is kind of fairly confirmed. And we have a narrative codification and solidification from the 16th century. You could see this in the corpora, but you could see this also in the analysis of Milarepa's corpus by Quintman, as well as the Mata Senesi's work on the crazy yogins and Tsangyen who codified this tradition and so on. So with the printing and also with especially the Kajipa getting patronage, these narratives were sometimes streamlined and they were laid down and they put nicely into order for the followers to read and be inspired, at the same time to kind of construct a tradition. And of course the pedigree became important even if there was no, let's say, Tulku system. There's another example, Shakya Chokden, for example. Shakya Chokden, again, supposedly is supposed to be of one mind stream with the seventh Karmapa. There's various sources telling us that. At the same time, there's a narrative about his rebirth as various other masters, but there is no official kind of role as in the reincarnation of Shakya Chokden and so on. Yeah, and so also with Dölpopa. So this kind of pedigree of earlier masters and what Pavo Rinpoche has criticized. I was the student of the Buddha and the great masters of India and Tibet. You find at the beginning of many narratives. So. At the same time, if you look at the political contexts, they intensify during that period in general. And at the same time, although there is no real form of government, because there is also no centralized government, you see it is linked to places and institutions. So this link is very important. Yeah. Well, meanwhile, alternatives such as inheritance or family, such as accomplishment or academic accomplishment still continue and possibly remain very important. So that means all the ingredients or features on the basis of these limited sources are there. And this maybe helps us to answer a few questions that I have tried to ask at the outset. So we have the political, the doctrinal, and let's say the narratives that construct a tulku as an institution that further and further emerges. So, and I think one key of this period is that there is awareness from one birth to the next. So one is not only a previous master, but there's awareness from one master to the other. And then on top of that, one is an embodiment of, let's say, Avalokiteshvara, an enlightened being. So one becomes an especially, let's say, elevated or important or inspiring type of tulku. So this is something that is actually put on top. Yeah, so maybe mixing the earlier ones where the kings were embodiment of Avalokiteshvara and his salvific activity with the chain of masters of the past, and then the practice of entering another body. Maybe these are the ingredients for the institutionalized tulku system, if you could call it a system. And one could also argue at this time anyway there was a tendency towards differentiation of the different sects. So there are many things we could reflect about and many tasks to do. And we could also reflect about the why, which I have tried. So why in the Tibetan cultural sphere, especially during this time, did this become so important? So Ulrike and I, we had also discussed at the site, and you had mentioned, I think, in your research about the Kadampa, that those institutions who did have a tulku might have more chances for survival than those without. So this is, of course, a thesis that one could follow on as securing the material continuation of a tradition as well as the spiritual continuation of a tradition. But of course, we have to inquire on a large number of cases about this. So because maybe some traditions died out not because of that. So this is then because some other factors we do not know. And I do think also, if you have a monastery with different branches, then the concept of place is important, that one monastery will always become the central monastery if the central monastery hosts the major tulku, yeah? The Panchanamas, Intashilimpo and so on. So the connection to place is of course clear. as well as the continuing spiritual guidance, which is what, of course, from the emic point of view, the sources profess. But I still do think there are many questions that remain. So, of course, I have addressed only a very, let's say, specific time window in a very specific tradition. So there's many others to be addressed, but I've tried to put this into context as much as possible. So there are other tasks that are ahead, I think, in this topic, and I'm wondering whether this will ever make it into a paper stage. But in any case, in contemporary research, there are already some papers about this, but this idea of education and the psychological dimension, I think, would be really interesting to follow up. So the way of how this education happened, what it could have done or could not have done, and so on. If you imagine that, those people are brought in front of an audience. I mean, today, of course, it wouldn't be possible, but that's the 16th century. Yeah. So you bring like 2 5-year-olds and you ask them academic questions, and one runs away and cries, and you say, "Sorry, mate, didn't make it." And the other one is very eloquent. Yeah. But at the same time, we do have this kind of, in some preschools and American kindergartens, maybe, that they're already at the age of 5, you have to do some kind of examinations. Yeah. So, but still, I think there is some dimension that we could look at. At the same time, this namta from a literary point of view about the in-between state could be very fruitful. As I said about the 7th Karmapa, there is one, there are many others that we should research. It tells us how the tradition conceives of and also portrays the awareness between one life and the next. Yeah? As well as the pre-birth stories, which I, as an historian, I must admit, sometimes I have overlooked a little. So I figure let's get to the date first. But of course, this is also important for the narrative, and maybe there is more to it. Maybe we can find patterns. Of course, the research about female tulkus is still in its beginnings. Hildegard Diemberger has made a portrayal from this time. About the Samding Dorje Pamo, I think also Sarah Jacobi, who was here, I think, last year or previously, had done some research on that. So there is much more to do in that regard, although, of course, the sources remain more scarce. But still, we should follow that up, as well as, of course, the link with the institutions and the survival, as I have mentioned. Maybe also even, to find a typology of these different practices as they're portrayed in the hagiographies. So the recognition practice according to traditions and so on. So in this kind of more quantitative research, as you could argue, has been started by Gray Tuttle on various ideas of the emergence of tulku lineages and which tradition did what. You can read this from 2017. It's quite interesting. But of course, as he admits, there are some limitations because we need to follow up on the actual reasons and explanations for these patterns and how these data were kind of sourced and how we got them. But I think this could be, to do this on a larger scale, shows also that in Amdo and Kam, for example, there was a major search into new tulku lines, for example. At the same time, you could argue maybe in Central and Tibet it was not so possible because there were already the established lines. So we don't know. So there are many things we don't know, but at the same time, I think I hope we got some little idea of the bewildering and puzzling phenomenon that is still crucial in this Tibetan cultural sphere from its very beginnings until today. Thank you very much.